I was sitting in my penthouse office on the 47th floor of the Meridian Tower, watching the Seattle skyline shimmer in the late afternoon sun, when my assistant buzzed in with news that would change everything. "Mrs. Johnson, your children are here. All three of them. They say it's urgent." The tone in Margaret's voice told me this wasn't a social visit. In my 62 years on this planet, I'd learned to read people like financial statements, and something in that carefully neutral voice warned me that my comfortable afternoon was about to become anything but. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was brewing when all three of my adult children had called within the same week, each with some variation of, "Mom, we need to talk." Rebecca, my eldest at 38, had used her lawyer voice. "Mother, there are some family matters we need to discuss." Marcus, 35 and perpetually dramatic, had been more direct. "Mom, this is serious. We all need to sit down together." And Sophie, my baby at 32, had tried the emotional approach. "Mama, please don't say no. We really need this meeting." The children filed into my office like they were approaching a boardroom negotiation, which, I suppose, they were. Rebecca led the charge, her designer heels clicking authoritatively against the marble floor, her Armani suit impeccable as always. She'd inherited my height and sharp cheekbones, but none of my warmth. Behind her came Marcus, looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his nervous energy filling the room like expensive cologne. Sophie brought up the rear, her artistic bohemian style a stark contrast to her siblings' corporate armor, but her face wearing the same determined expression. They arranged themselves on the leather sofa across from my desk like a tribunal, and I knew immediately that whatever they were about to propose, I wasn't going to like it. Rebecca, always the spokesperson, cleared her throat and began what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "Mother, we've been talking, and we're concerned about your recent decisions regarding the family wealth." Her voice carried that particular blend of condescension and fake concern that she'd perfected during her years as a corporate attorney. "We think it's time we had a serious conversation about succession planning and ensuring the family legacy is protected." I leaned back in my chair, the same chair from which I'd built a technology empire worth over $200 million, and studied the three people I'd brought into this world, the three people I'd sacrificed everything to provide for, educate, and launch into successful adulthood. The three people who apparently thought I was too senile or irresponsible to manage my own fortune. "What exactly are you concerned about?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the irritation building in my chest. Marcus jumped in, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to be heard. "Mom, you donated $5 million to that homeless shelter last month without even telling us. $5 million. And before that, it was $3 million to the Children's Hospital, and $2 million to that scholarship fund for underprivileged kids. You're giving away our inheritance." Our inheritance. Not my money that I'd earned through decades of 18-hour days, sleepless nights, and risks that had nearly given me ulcers. Our inheritance, as if my bank account was their birthright. Sophie, ever the peacemaker, tried to soften the blow. "Mama, we're not saying you can't be generous. We love that you want to help people. But maybe we could be more involved in these decisions? Make sure the donations are strategic and tax efficient?" Tax efficient. I'd built my fortune by revolutionizing data security software, survived the dot-com crash, weathered the 2008 recession, and expanded into international markets. But my 32-year-old daughter, whose biggest financial decision was choosing between a latte and a cappuccino, wanted to make my charitable giving more tax efficient. Rebecca sensed she was losing control of the narrative and quickly regained her footing. "What we're proposing is a family foundation. We could structure it so that all major financial decisions require majority approval from the family board. That way, we're all involved in preserving what you've worked so hard to build. A family foundation with majority approval. In other words, a way to legally prevent me from spending my own money without their permission." I sat there, looking at these three adults I'd raised, and realized they weren't seeing Nettie Johnson, the woman who'd started with nothing and built an empire. They were seeing an elderly woman with too much money and too little sense, someone who needed to be managed like an asset in their portfolio. And who would be on this family board? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, the four of us, naturally, Rebecca said. You'd have your vote, but with all of us working together, we could make sure every decision benefits the whole family. The whole family. I almost laughed at the audacity. When had any of them worked for the benefit of the whole family? Rebecca, who'd taken a $250,000 loan from me to start her law practice and had never paid back a penny, claiming family loans were different from real debt. Marcus, who'd burned through $500,000 on his failed restaurant ventures before finally landing a job at a tech startup, where he spent more time networking than working. Sophie, who'd used my connections to get her art displayed in galleries that wouldn't have given her a second glance without the Johnson name attached. I'd given them everything they'd ever asked for. Private schools, Ivy League educations, startup capital for their careers, down payments on their homes, cars, vacations, and endless opportunities that most people could only dream of. I'd handed them the keys to success and watched them coast through life on my achievements, and now they wanted to take away my right to decide how my own money was spent. This is quite a proposal, I said finally. Tell me, what prompted this sudden concern for the family legacy? The three of them exchanged glances, and I caught the subtle eye roll that Rebecca tried to hide. It was Marcus who finally answered, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something. Mom, be honest. You're 62 years old. You should be enjoying your retirement, not working yourself to death. And some of your recent decisions have been, well, impulsive. The homeless shelter donation was made after you read one newspaper article. The children's hospital gift happened because you met one doctor at a dinner party. That's not strategic philanthropy. Impulsive. My donations were impulsive because I hadn't consulted a committee of people who'd never earned a dollar of their own money. I thought about that newspaper article Marcus mentioned, the one about families living in their cars during Seattle's housing crisis. I thought about the doctor I'd met drive, Patricia Chen, who told me about children dying because her hospital couldn't afford the latest life-saving equipment. Those donations hadn't been impulsive. They'd been purposeful, immediate responses to urgent human need. But my children saw them as reckless spending that threatened their future comfort. Sophie tried a different approach, her voice soft and persuasive. Mama, we just want to be part of your legacy. You've built something incredible, and we want to honor that by being good stewards of what you've created. Isn't that what you'd want? What I'd want? I'd wanted children who understood the value of hard work, who appreciated the opportunities I'd given them, who would use their advantages to make the world better. Instead, I'd raised three adults who saw my generosity as a threat to their inheritance and my independence as a problem to be solved. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city I'd helped shape with my technology and my philanthropy. Below me, Seattle pulsed with life and possibility. Somewhere down there, kids were getting their first computers through my educational initiatives. Families were finding shelter through my housing programs. Entrepreneurs were getting their start with loans from my small business fund. My money was doing exactly what I wanted it to do, making the world better. I appreciate your concern, I said, turning back to face my children. And I understand that you feel entitled to have a say in how I spend my money. After all, you've been spending it your entire lives. Rebecca's face flushed. Mother, that's not fair. We're not asking for money.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
We're asking to be included in important family decisions. Aren't you? I returned to my desk and pulled out a file I'd been hoping I wouldn't need. Because this isn't the first time we've had this conversation, is it? I opened the file and pulled out a series of documents. 6 months ago, Rebecca, you suggested I hire a financial advisor to help with my, quote, erratic spending patterns. 4 months ago, Marcus, you proposed that I establish a trust with you as the primary trustee. 2 months ago, Sophie, you brought me brochures for luxury retirement communities, suggesting I might be happier somewhere with less responsibility. The silence in the room was deafening. My children sat frozen, realizing that I'd been keeping track of their increasingly bold attempts to control my finances. Each time, you've approached me with concern for my well-being, my legacy, my happiness. But what you're really concerned about is that I'm giving away money you've already spent in your minds. Money you've been counting on to maintain the lifestyle I've provided for you your entire lives. Marcus started to protest, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. You want to know about family legacy? Let me tell you about the legacy I inherited from my parents. My father was a janitor at Boeing. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on Capitol Hill. They worked 16-hour days to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. They taught me that money isn't something you're entitled to. It's something you earn through hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance. I pulled out another document, one that would change everything. They also taught me that the greatest gift you can give your children isn't money. It's the knowledge that they can survive and thrive on their own merits. Rebecca's lawyer instincts kicked in, and she leaned forward. Mother, what is that document? I smiled for the first time since they'd walked into my office. This is my new will, the one I had finalized this morning, just in case this meeting went exactly the way I thought it would. The color drained from all three faces simultaneously. According to this document, each of you will inherit exactly $1 from my estate. The remainder of my wealth, approximately $200 million, will be donated to charity upon my death. Sophie gasped. Marcus looked like he might faint. Rebecca shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking. You can't be serious. Mother, this is insane. We're your children. Yes, you are. And as my children, you've received more opportunities, advantages, and direct financial support than 99% of the population will see in their entire lifetimes. But apparently, that wasn't enough. You wanted control over money you didn't earn, decisions you hadn't qualified to make, and a legacy you hadn't built. I stood up again, feeling more energized than I had in months. So here's what's going to happen. You have exactly 1 year to prove to me that you understand the value of money and hard work. You each need to earn $100,000 through your own efforts, without using any of my connections, influence, or financial support. No family loans, no networking through my contacts, no leveraging the Johnson name to open doors. Marcus found his voice first. Mom, that's impossible. Our entire careers are built on the connections you gave us. Exactly. Which means you have no idea what you're actually capable of achieving on your own. This is your chance to find out. Rebecca was pacing now, her legal mind working through the implications. This is emotional blackmail. You're punishing us for caring about our family's financial security. I'm giving you a chance to earn what you've been taking for granted your entire lives. If each of you can prove you understand the value of $1 by earning 100,000 of them honestly, I'll reconsider my will. But you have to do it without any advantages I've provided. New names, new cities, new careers if necessary. You need to experience what 99% of the world experiences every day, the need to create your own success. Sophie was crying now, her bohemian confidence crumbling. Mama, this isn't fair. We never asked to be born into wealth. We didn't choose this life. No, you didn't, but you did choose to take it for granted. You chose to see my generosity as weakness, my independence as senility, and my charitable giving as theft from your inheritance. Those were choices, Sophie. And choices have consequences. I walked around my desk and stood in front of my 3 children, these adults I'd raised to be strong, independent, and compassionate, who had instead become entitled, dependent, and selfish. I love each of you more than you'll ever understand. But love doesn't mean enabling. Love means preparing you for a world that won't hand you everything simply because you exist. If I died tomorrow and left you hundreds of millions of dollars, you'd burn through it within a decade, because you have no concept of what money represents. You see it as an endless resource, rather than the result of human effort and sacrifice. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, her lawyer persona returning. And if we refuse to participate in this ridiculous test? Then you'll inherit exactly what you've earned from me, $1 each. The will is already filed with my attorney. The only way to change it is for all 3 of you to complete the challenge successfully. Marcus slumped back into the sofa. Mom, be reasonable. $100,000 in a year, starting from scratch? That's more than most people make. Exactly. It's a fortune to someone who's never had to earn their own way. But for people who work hard, take risks, and apply themselves, it's achievable. The question is, are you those people? Or are you just the children of someone who was? I returned to my chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. You came here today to throw me a pity party, to make me feel guilty for spending my own money on causes I believe in. You wanted me to see myself as a confused old woman who needed management. Instead, you're going to get a reality check worth $200 million. Sophie wiped her eyes and looked up at me with something that might have been respect for the first time in years. What if we can't do it? What if we fail? Then you'll learn something invaluable about failure, which is that it's not the end of the world. It's information. And you'll discover resources within yourselves that you never knew existed because you never had to access them. Rebecca was reading through the document I'd handed her, her face growing paler with each page. Mother, this is legally binding. You've really thought this through. I've been thinking about it for years. Every time one of you made a decision based on what you expected to inherit rather than what you'd earned. Every time you criticized my charitable giving as if my money belonged to you. Every time you treated your advantages as entitlements rather than privileges. I looked at each of them in turn, these three people who carried my DNA but had forgotten my values. Here's what I'm offering you. The chance to become the people I raised you to be instead of the people you've chosen to become. The opportunity to discover that you're capable of more than you've ever demanded of yourselves. The possibility of earning not just money, but self-respect, confidence, and the knowledge that you can survive anything life throws at you. Marcus looked up from his hands. And if we succeed, if we each make $100,000 in a year without using your help, then we'll renegotiate my will. But more importantly, you'll have proven to yourselves that you don't need my money to be successful. You'll have discovered that the greatest inheritance I can give you isn't cash. It's the knowledge that you're capable of creating your own wealth. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of Seattle traffic 47 floors below. My children sat there, processing the fact that their comfortable, predictable future had just evaporated, replaced by a challenge that would require them to discover who they really were beneath the privilege I'd provided. Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. Where would we even start? Wherever people without trust funds and family connections start, I replied. You figure it out. You research, you take risks, you fail, and then you try again. You do what I did when I started my first company in a garage with $3,000 and a dream. Sophie looked around my office, at the awards lining the walls, the photos of me with world leaders and tech innovators, the evidence of everything I'd built from nothing. You really started with $3,000? I started with $3,000, an idea for better data encryption, and the absolute certainty that failure wasn't an option because I had no safety net to fall back on. I worked 18-hour days for 3 years, slept on the office floor more nights than I slept in a bed, and lived on ramen noodles and vending machine coffee. I didn't have parents who could bail me out or a trust fund to fall back on. I had to succeed or I'd lose everything. Marcus shook his head. But we don't have your background. We don't know how to code or run tech companies. You don't need to do what I did. You need to figure out what you can do. Rebecca, you're a lawyer. There are a million ways for lawyers to make money. Marcus, you have an MBA and experience in the restaurant industry. Sophie, you're an artist with a degree in fine arts, and more creativity in your little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. The skills are there. What's been missing is the motivation. I stood up and walked to the door, signaling that our meeting was over. You have a choice to make. You can spend the next year angry at me for taking away the inheritance you were counting on. Or you can spend it discovering what you're truly capable of when you're fighting for something instead of waiting for it to be handed to you. Rebecca gathered her papers and stood up, her professional mask back in place, but something different in her eyes. How will you know if we're following the rules? How will you verify that we're not using your connections or influence? Because I'll be watching. And because if you cheat, You'll only be cheating yourselves out of the chance to discover your own strength. Sophie hugged me before leaving, something she hadn't done in months. I love you, Mama. Even though I'm terrified and angry and completely overwhelmed, I love you. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you know. Marcus paused at the door. Mom, what if this destroys our family? What if we can't forgive you for this? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be strong but who had never been tested. If our family can only survive when it's based on financial dependence and entitlement, then it's already destroyed. This is our chance to build something real. After they left, I sat alone in my office as the Seattle skyline transformed from afternoon gold to evening purple. Margaret buzzed in to ask if I needed anything, but I sent her home early. I wanted to sit with what I'd just done, this radical act of love disguised as cruelty. People would think I was crazy. A mother who'd cut her children out of her will, who'd force them into poverty to teach them a lesson. But those people wouldn't understand that I hadn't cut my children off. I'd set them free. For 30 years, I'd watched my children live in the shadow of my success, never pushing themselves because they never had to, never discovering their own capabilities because everything had always been provided. I'd given them everything except the one thing that mattered most, the knowledge that they could survive and thrive on their own merits. Tomorrow, Rebecca would wake up in her $1 million condo and realize she couldn't afford the mortgage without my help. Marcus would look at his expensive lifestyle and understand that his trust fund payments were ending. Sophie would have to decide if her art was worth pursuing when it meant actual financial risk rather than a hobby funded by family money. They would hate me at first. They would call me manipulative, cruel, unfair. They would tell their friends that their mother had lost her mind and cut them off without cause. But eventually, if I was right about the people I'd raised them to be deep down, they would discover something magnificent. They were capable of far more than they'd ever demanded of themselves. I thought about my own parents, working those 16-hour days to provide for our family. They'd never had the luxury of giving me everything I wanted, so they'd given me something better, the certainty that I could earn whatever I needed. They'd taught me that the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's resilience. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Dr. Patricia Chen from Seattle Children's Hospital. Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to thank you again for your incredible donation. The new cardiac wing is going to save hundreds of children's lives. You've given these kids a future they wouldn't have had otherwise. I smiled, feeling the weight of my decision settle into something that felt like peace. Doctor, what's the most important gift you can give a child? She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I suppose it's the chance to grow up healthy and strong, knowing they can handle whatever life brings them. Exactly. The chance to discover their own strength. After I hung up, I pulled out a legal pad and began writing letters to my children. Letters they wouldn't receive for 6 months. Letters that would remind them why I'd done this when the challenge felt impossible and they wanted to give up. The letter to Rebecca began, My dearest daughter, by the time you read this, you'll have been struggling for 6 months to build something with your own hands instead of inheriting something built by mine. I hope you're angry. I hope you're exhausted. I hope you're discovering muscles you never knew you had, both physical and emotional. The letter to Marcus started, My beloved son, you called this challenge impossible, but I know better. I know the man I raised, the boy who built incredible Lego cities and refused to quit even when the designs seemed too complex. That boy is still inside you, waiting to remember what it feels like to fight for something instead of waiting for it. Sophie's letter opened with, My creative, passionate daughter, you've always had the biggest heart in our family, but you've never had to put that heart on the line for something that mattered. Art isn't just about beauty. It's about courage. It's about creating something from nothing and standing behind it even when the world doesn't understand. I wrote late into the night, pouring 30 years of parental love and wisdom into words that would serve as lifelines when my children felt like drowning in the challenge I'd set before them. Because this wasn't about punishing them for their entitlement. This was about loving them enough to demand they become the extraordinary people I knew they could be. At midnight, I sealed the letters and locked them in my office safe. In 6 months, when my children were exhausted and struggling and questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves, These letters would remind them that their mother believed in them more than they believed in themselves. The truth was, I didn't care about the money. $200 million was just paper if it was going to people who would waste it. But if my children could prove they understood the value of earning their own way, if they could discover the strength and resilience I'd always seen in them, then they would have inherited something far more valuable than cash. They would have inherited the ability to create wealth rather than simply consume it. I looked out at the city lights twinkling below and thought about all the people down there working night shifts, building businesses, pursuing dreams that seemed impossible. Tomorrow, my 3 children would join those ranks. They would discover what it meant to be hungry, desperate, and determined. They would learn the difference between wanting something and needing it. And if I was right about the people I'd raised them to be, they would thank me for it someday. The challenge had begun. The first 3 months after what my children had dubbed Black Tuesday played out exactly as I'd expected, though watching it unfold was more painful than I'd anticipated. Each of my children reacted to their new reality in ways that revealed both their character flaws and their hidden strengths, often simultaneously. Rebecca, true to her Type A personality, approached the challenge like a legal case she was determined to win. Within 48 hours of our meeting, she'd moved out of her $1 million condo and into a studio apartment in Capitol Hill that cost $800 a month. She'd traded her BMW for a 10-year-old Honda Civic and started shopping at thrift stores with the methodical efficiency she'd once applied to corporate mergers. But she also tried to game the system in ways that made me question whether I'd raised a daughter or a strategist. 2 weeks into her challenge, she called me from a coffee shop, her voice carefully controlled. "Mother, I need clarification on the rules. You said I couldn't use your connections, but what about connections I made through my own work? Clients I represented who had nothing to do with you." I'd been expecting this call. Rebecca had always been brilliant at finding loopholes, and I admired the skill even as I prepared to close the door she was trying to open. "Rebecca, let me ask you something. How did you get into Harvard Law School?" "Through my own merit. My grades, my LSAT scores, my essay." "And how did you afford Harvard Law School?" A long pause. "You paid for it." "And how did you get your first job at Morrison, Klein & Associates?" Another pause, longer this time. "You introduced me to Jonathan Morrison at a charity gala." "And how did you build your client base during your first 5 years of practice?" "Through referrals from people who knew our family." Her voice was getting smaller with each admission. "So when you ask about using connections from your own work, what you're really asking is whether you can leverage relationships that exist because I paid for your education and opened doors for your career. Is that the spirit of this challenge, Rebecca?" I heard her sigh, a sound that carried 38 years of frustration and, for the first time, genuine self-awareness. "No, it's not." "Then you have your answer." What impressed me about Rebecca wasn't that she tried to find loopholes. It was that when I closed them, she adapted. She took a job as a paralegal at a small immigration law firm, making $35,000 a year, and learning what it felt like to be the person who couldn't afford her own former hourly rate. She started tutoring high school students for the SATs in the evenings, earning $25 an hour for work that required her to remember what it felt like to explain things to people instead of talking down to them. But the real transformation began when she discovered she was actually good at helping people who couldn't fight for themselves. The immigration cases she worked on weren't corporate mergers with million-dollar fees. They were families trying to stay together, children seeking asylum, workers trying to gain legal status. For the first time in her career, Rebecca was using her legal training to solve problems that mattered to people who had no other options. "Mother, I had to translate for a woman today whose husband is being deported," she told me during one of our monthly check-in calls. She has 3 kids, all American citizens, and she was so scared she could barely speak. I realized that in 15 years of practicing law, I'd never actually helped anyone who truly needed help. How did that feel? Terrifying and exhilarating and humbling all at the same time. Like I was finally using my brain for something that mattered instead of just something that paid well. Marcus took a completely different approach, one that revealed both his creativity and his complete lack of understanding about how money worked in the real world. His first brilliant idea was to start a food truck, which he announced to me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. Mom, it's perfect. Low overhead, direct customer contact, and I can use all my restaurant experience. I'm going to sell gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches with artisanal ingredients. And how are you financing this food truck? Well, I found a used truck for $15,000, and with permits and equipment, I figure I need about $30,000 to get started. Marcus, where are you planning to get $30,000? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about my son's financial literacy. He'd lived his entire adult life with access to family money, and the concept of starting a business without capital had literally never occurred to him. I guess I need to figure that out, he said finally. I guess you do. What followed was 6 weeks of Marcus discovering what most entrepreneurs learn the hard way. The great ideas are worthless without execution, and execution requires resources you don't have. He spent 2 weeks researching food truck loans before realizing he had no credit history in his own name. Everything had always been co-signed by me, or paid for directly from family accounts. He looked into investors before realizing he had no business plan, no market research, and no track record of success that wasn't connected to family money. He considered partners before understanding that he had nothing to offer except enthusiasm and a famous last name he wasn't allowed to use. The breakdown came on a Thursday evening when he called me sobbing. Mom, I can't do this. I have $800 in my checking account. I'm living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 roommates, and I just spent $40 on groceries that need to last me 2 weeks. I don't know how to be poor. I don't know how to live without money. It was the first honest thing Marcus had said to me in years, and it broke my heart even as it filled me with hope. Marcus, do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted to buy that expensive skateboard? The one you made me save my allowance for? I hated you for that. And how did you feel when you finally bought it with money you'd saved yourself? Like it was actually mine, like I'd earned it. He was quiet for a moment. I see what you're doing, Mom. What am I doing? You're teaching me how to want something badly enough to work for it instead of just expecting it to appear. Marcus eventually found work as a line cook at a busy downtown restaurant, making $12 an hour plus tips and discovering muscles he didn't know he had. The work was harder than anything he'd ever done, but he was learning skills that no business school had taught him. How to work under pressure, how to coordinate with the team when failure meant hungry customers, how to find pride in doing simple work well. But the real breakthrough came when he started paying attention to the restaurant's operations with the eye of someone who understood business, rather than someone who was just collecting a paycheck. He noticed that food waste was eating into profits, that scheduling was inefficient, that the inventory system was creating unnecessary costs. I asked my manager if I could make some suggestions, he told me during one of our calls. She laughed at first, but then I showed her how much money they could save by changing when they prep vegetables and how they schedule deliveries. She implemented 3 of my ideas in the first week. And how did that feel? Like I was actually contributing something valuable, instead of just taking up space. Like my MBA might actually be useful for something other than impressing people at parties. 6 weeks later, Marcus had been promoted to assistant manager with a salary of $45,000. More importantly, he'd discovered that he was good at operations, at seeing systems and finding ways to make them more efficient. It wasn't the glamorous entrepreneurship he'd imagined, but it was real work that created real value. Sophie's journey was the most unpredictable and, in many ways, the most transformative. As an artist, she'd always been the most emotional of my children, and she took the challenge as a personal rejection of everything she'd ever tried to create. You're essentially telling me that my art is worthless, she said during our first check-in call, her voice heavy with tears and resentment. That unless I can make money from it, it doesn't matter. Sophie, I'm telling you that your art needs to support you instead of you supporting it. There's a difference. That's not how art works, Mama. Real artists don't create for money. They create because they have to, because they have something to say. And starving artists don't eat, which means they eventually stop creating altogether. Sophie's first 3 months were the hardest to watch. She'd never held a real job, having spent the past decade calling herself a professional artist while living off family money and creating paintings that sold occasionally through galleries that displayed them as favors to me. Her crash course in financial reality was brutal. She took a job at a coffee shop, making minimum wage, and discovered that standing on her feet for 8 hours while dealing with demanding customers was exhausting in ways that painting never was. She moved into a shared house with 4 other struggling artists and learned that privacy was a luxury she'd taken for granted. But she also discovered something that surprised both of us. She was good with people. The coffee shop customers loved her, and she started building relationships that had nothing to do with her last name or her family's wealth. For the first time in her life, people liked Sophie Johnson the person, not Sophie Johnson the rich girl who dabbled in art. "There's this regular customer named Elena," she told me one evening. "She's a nurse at Harborview, and she works double shifts to support her mom who has dementia. She orders the same drink every day, and we talk about everything. Her dreams, her fears, her hope that she can save enough money to go back to school. And how does that make you feel? Like I've been living in a bubble my entire life. Like I've never had a real conversation with anyone who had real problems." The transformation in Sophie's art came gradually, then all at once. Surrounded by people who were struggling, working, dreaming, and fighting for better lives, she started creating pieces that reflected the humanity she was encountering instead of the abstract concepts she'd been exploring in her privileged isolation. Her paintings became more urgent, more emotional, more connected to the experiences of real people facing real challenges. And for the first time in her artistic career, strangers started buying her work because it spoke to them, not because they wanted to own something created by Nettie Johnson's daughter. "I sold 3 paintings this month," she announced during our 4th-month check-in, and the pride in her voice was something I'd never heard before. "Not through a gallery, not through your connections. I set up a booth at the Pike Place Market and people bought my work because they connected with it. How much did you make?" $1,200. Which might not sound like much to you, but it's money I earned by creating something that mattered to someone else. It's the first money I've ever made that felt completely mine. The monthly check-in calls became my favorite part of this entire experiment. Not because I enjoyed watching my children struggle, but because I was finally getting to know them as people, rather than as extensions of my wealth and influence. Rebecca started talking about opening her own immigration law practice, specializing in helping families who couldn't afford big firm rates. "I want to create something that makes a difference," she said, "not just something that makes money." Marcus was developing plans for a consulting business that would help small restaurants improve their operations and reduce waste. "I'm good at seeing inefficiencies and fixing them," he told me. "And I understand what it's like to work in a kitchen now, so I can suggest solutions that actually work for the people doing the job." Sophie was planning her first solo art show, featuring paintings inspired by the working people she'd met since starting her challenge. "I want to call it Invisible Hands," she said, "because I spent my whole life not seeing the people who made my comfortable life possible." But the most significant change wasn't in their career plans or their artistic vision. It was in how they talked about money, work, and their relationship with privilege. "I used to think poor people were just lazy or unlucky," Rebecca admitted during one of our calls. "I had no idea how much mental energy it takes to constantly worry about money, how exhausting it is to work multiple jobs, how many barriers exist for people who don't have connections or safety nets." Marcus had a similar revelation. "I always thought I was smart and hardworking, but I realize now that I was just smart and hardworking within a system that was rigged in my favor. The people I work with now are twice as smart and 10 times as hardworking as I ever was, but they don't have the advantages I had." Sophie's insight was perhaps the most profound. "I used to think that struggling for your art was romantic, that poverty made artists more authentic. But actually struggling taught me that poverty just makes everything harder. It doesn't make you more creative. It makes you more desperate. Real creativity comes from having the freedom to take risks, not from having no other choice." By the 4th month, something unexpected was happening. My children weren't just adapting to their new circumstances. They were thriving in ways they never had when money wasn't a concern. They were discovering capabilities, developing relationships, and finding purposes that had been hidden under layers of privilege and entitlement. But they were also discovering something else. That their mother wasn't the controlling, manipulative woman they'd painted me as in their minds. I was someone who had faced the same challenges they were facing, and had found ways to overcome them. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Rebecca said during our 4th-month call. "I realize now that when we came to your office with that family foundation proposal, we were basically telling you that you were too old and too senile to manage your own money. That was incredibly disrespectful. And I realized that I never truly appreciated what you accomplished," Marcus added. "Building a company from nothing, especially as a woman in tech in the 80s and 90s, that must have been incredibly difficult." Sophie's apology was the most emotional. "Mama, I'm so sorry for taking everything for granted. I'm sorry for never asking about your struggles, for never appreciating the sacrifices you made. I'm sorry for seeing your success as something that just existed instead of something you created through years of hard work." These conversations were healing wounds I hadn't even realized existed. For years, I'd felt like my children saw me as a bank account with a pulse, someone whose value was measured entirely by what I could provide for them. But as they learned to value their own contributions to the world, they began to see mine differently too. However, not everything was going smoothly. The challenge was creating stress fractures in their personal relationships that hadn't been designed to withstand financial pressure. Rebecca's boyfriend, a fellow lawyer who had never seen her as anything but successful and wealthy, was struggling with her new circumstances. "He keeps offering to pay for things," she told me. "Dinner, movies, weekends away. And when I remind him that I can't accept help, he gets frustrated and says I'm being stubborn. How do you feel about that? Like he's never really seen me as an equal partner, like he was dating my portfolio as much as he was dating me." Marcus was having similar issues. His circle of friends, all successful professionals who were used to expensive restaurants and exotic vacations, were gradually excluding him from activities he couldn't afford. "It's not malicious," he explained. "But when everyone wants to go skiing in Aspen or out to dinner at places where the entrees cost $50, and you have to keep saying no, eventually they stop asking. And how does that make you feel?" Sad, but also relieved. I'm realizing that a lot of those friendships were pretty shallow, based on what we could afford to do together, rather than who we actually were as people. Sophie's relationship challenges were different, but equally revealing. She'd been dating an artist who had resented her family wealth and had constantly criticized her for not being authentic enough in her struggles. "He keeps saying that this challenge doesn't count because I chose it," she told me. "That real poverty is different because you don't have an escape route." What do you think about that? I think he's right that this isn't the same as being born into poverty with no advantages. But I also think he's missed the point. This isn't about proving I can be poor. It's about proving I can be self-sufficient. The relationship ended when Sophie realized that her boyfriend was more invested in her failure than her success, that he wanted her to stay dependent and unsuccessful because it made him feel superior. "I was with someone who wanted me to be weak so he could feel strong," she realized. "That's not love. That's something else entirely." These relationship revelations were painful but necessary. My children were learning to distinguish between people who valued them for themselves and people who valued them for what they could provide or represent. It was a lesson I'd had to learn the hard way during my own climb to success, and I was glad they were learning it while they were still young enough to find healthier relationships. But the most significant development during these middle months wasn't professional or personal. It was psychological. My children were developing something they'd never had before, genuine self-confidence based on their own achievements rather than inherited advantages. "I know this sounds weird," Rebecca told me, "but I'm proud of myself in a way I've never been before. Not because someone told me I was smart or successful, but because I earned something difficult through my own effort." Marcus echoed the sentiment. "I never understood why you worked so hard even after you had enough money to retire. But now I get it. There's something addictive about creating value, about solving problems, about earning your place in the world." Sophie's insight was characteristically artistic. "It's like the difference between wearing a beautiful dress someone bought you and wearing one you made yourself. Even if it's not as expensive or perfectly tailored, it fits you differently because it came from your own hands." As the 5th month began, I started receiving reports from my private investigator, a necessity I'd implemented to ensure my children weren't breaking the rules of the challenge. What I discovered was that none of them were even tempted to cheat. They were too invested in proving to themselves that they could succeed. Rebecca had been offered help by former colleagues and had turned it down. Marcus had been approached by family friends who wanted to offer him business opportunities and had declined. Sophie had been invited to display her work in galleries that would have featured her because of my reputation, and had chosen to continue selling her pieces at markets and coffee shops where people bought them because they genuinely appreciated the art. They weren't just following the rules of the challenge, they were embracing the spirit of it in ways that went beyond what I'd required. They were discovering that authentic achievement felt better than inherited privilege, that earned respect meant more than automatic deference, that relationships based on equality were more satisfying than relationships based on financial advantage. But they were also learning the harsh realities that come with self-sufficiency. Rebecca was exhausted from working 2 jobs while trying to build a client base. Marcus was frustrated by how slowly he could advance without connections to accelerate his progress. Sophie was discouraged by how difficult it was to make a living as an artist, even when her work was genuinely good. During our 5th-month check-in calls, I heard something in their voices that I recognized from my own early years. The bone-deep weariness that comes from working without a safety net, combined with the fierce determination that develops when failure means losing everything you've worked for. Some days I'm so tired I can barely think straight, Rebecca admitted. But other days I feel more alive than I ever have. Like I'm finally living my own life instead of the life you provided for me. The work is harder than I expected, Marcus said, but it's also more satisfying. When I solve a problem now, it's because I figured it out myself, not because I had resources to throw at it until it went away. Sophie's reflection was perhaps the most profound. I'm scared all the time now. Scared I won't make rent. Scared my art won't sell. Scared I'm not as talented as I thought I was. But I'm also more creative than I've ever been. Because the fear is pushing me to try things I never would have risked when failure didn't have real consequences. Fear as a creative catalyst was something I understood intimately. In my early days building my company, terror had been my constant companion and my greatest motivator. The fear of losing everything had pushed me to work longer, think harder, and take risks that a comfortable person never would have considered. But I was also starting to see the toll the challenge was taking on my children, and I began to question whether I'd been too harsh. Had I pushed them into a crucible that would strengthen them or break them? Was I teaching them valuable lessons about self-reliance? Or was I simply punishing them for being born into privilege they hadn't asked for? The answer came during an unexpected phone call from Sophie on a Tuesday evening in the 5th month. Mama, I need to tell you something and I need you to not interrupt until I'm finished. Okay. This challenge is the hardest thing I've ever done. I've been hungry, scared, exhausted, and humiliated more times than I can count. I've questioned everything I thought I knew about myself, about work, about relationships, about what matters in life. She paused, and I held my breath, afraid of what she might say next. And it's also the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm finally living my own life, creating my own success, building relationships based on who I am rather than what I can provide. I'm proud of myself in a way I never was when everything was handed to me. She paused again, and when she continued, her voice was strong and clear. You didn't punish us, Mama. You set us free. You loved us enough to let us discover that we're capable of more than we ever imagined. And I want you to know that whether I succeed or fail at this challenge, I'm grateful you gave me the chance to find out who I really am. After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the Seattle skyline and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete confidence that I'd made the right decision as a parent. My children were becoming the people I'd always hoped they could be, not because I'd given them everything, but because I'd finally demanded they give everything to themselves. The challenge was more than halfway complete, and, regardless of whether they reached the financial goal, they'd already achieved something far more valuable: the knowledge that they were capable of creating their own success. The question now was whether they could sustain their progress long enough to cross the finish line, and what they would choose to do with their newfound strength once they got there. The 6th month brought unexpected challenges that tested not just my children's financial resolve, but their emotional resilience in ways none of us had anticipated. What started as a straightforward test of their ability to earn money had evolved into something much more complex: a complete reconstruction of their identities, relationships, and understanding of their place in the world. The crisis began with Rebecca, who called me on a rainy Thursday morning with a voice I barely recognized. Gone was the confident attorney who had walked into my office 6 months earlier, replaced by someone who sounded broken and defeated. Mother, I think I need to quit. I can't do this anymore. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports, but Rebecca's tone made me push everything aside and give her my complete attention. In all her 38 years, I had never heard my eldest daughter sound so utterly depleted. What happened, Rebecca? Everything is falling apart. My biggest client at the immigration firm, Maria Santos, she was deported yesterday. I spent 3 months working on her case, researching every possible legal avenue, filing appeals, coordinating with advocacy groups. I thought I had found a way to keep her family together. Her voice cracked, and I could hear the tears she was trying to hold back. I stayed up until 2 in the morning for weeks, learning immigration law that they don't teach in corporate law school. I visited her in detention, translated documents, held her hand when she was terrified. And it wasn't enough. They took her away from her 3 children, and there's nothing I can do about it. This was new territory for Rebecca. In her previous career, failure meant losing money or a business deal. Here, failure meant a mother being separated from her children, a family being destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. Rebecca, you can't save everyone. That's not how the legal system works. But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? The legal system doesn't work for people like Maria. It works for people like me. People who can afford lawyers who charge $500 an hour. People who have connections and influence and safety nets. I recognized the tone in her voice. It was the same despair I had felt during my early years in business, when I realized how much the deck was stacked against people without advantages, how hard it was to succeed when you were fighting systems designed to benefit those who already had everything. And it gets worse, Rebecca continued. The firm is letting me go. They said my case success rate isn't high enough, that I'm spending too much time on difficult cases, instead of focusing on the ones that are likely to generate positive outcomes. They want lawyers who can produce victories, not lawyers who care about justice. The irony was devastating. Rebecca was being fired for developing exactly the qualities I had hoped this challenge would teach her: empathy, dedication to something beyond personal gain, and a willingness to fight for people who had no other advocates. What are you going to do? I don't know. I have 2 weeks to find another job, and immigration law positions are scarce. I could go back to corporate law, but after working with real people facing real problems, I can't imagine spending my days helping corporations avoid taxes or writing contracts for million-dollar mergers. So don't. Don't what? Don't go back to corporate law. Don't compromise on what you've discovered about yourself. Find another way. Mother, I need to make $92,000 in the next 6 months to meet your challenge. I can't do that working at legal aid clinics or pro bono immigration work. The math doesn't work. Rebecca, what would you do if there was no challenge? If money wasn't a factor at all? The question caught her off guard, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering. I would start my own practice specializing in immigration law. I would charge higher income clients enough to subsidize cases for people who can't afford legal representation. I would create a sliding fee scale based on income and family circumstances. Then do that. I can't. Starting a practice requires capital I don't have, clients I haven't built relationships with, and a reputation in immigration law that I'm still developing. It would take years to build something sustainable. Rebecca, 6 months ago you came to my office convinced that you needed to control my finances because I was making impulsive decisions. Do you remember what you said about strategic planning? That major financial decisions should be made carefully, with proper research and long-term thinking. And now you're telling me that you won't pursue work that fulfills you because it doesn't fit into a 12-month timeline. Which one of us is being impulsive now? The silence that followed told me that Rebecca was beginning to understand the trap she had created for herself. She was so focused on the immediate goal of earning $100,000 that she was abandoning the very purpose that had given her life meaning for the first time in her career. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you think beyond this challenge. That you make decisions based on who you want to be in 5 years, not just whether you can earn a specific amount of money in the next 6 months. But if I don't meet the challenge, I lose my inheritance. Rebecca, what have you gained in the past 6 months that you didn't have before? Another long pause. Self-respect. Purpose. The knowledge that I can survive on my own. Relationships with people who value me for what I contribute, rather than what I can provide. Are you willing to give those up to focus solely on earning money? Number, but I also don't want to disappoint you. Rebecca, the only way you could disappoint me now is if you stopped being the person this challenge has helped you become. 2 days later, Rebecca called me back with a plan that demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking she had accused me of lacking. She had found a part-time position at a small firm that handled a mix of immigration and family law cases, allowing her to continue developing her expertise while providing steady income. She had also connected with a nonprofit that provided legal services to immigrant families, where she could volunteer in exchange for training and experience. Most importantly, she had started networking with other immigration attorneys, not to leverage connections for personal advancement, but to learn from people who had built sustainable practices serving the communities she wanted to help. I'm not going to make $100,000 this year, she told me, but I'm going to build the foundation for a practice that will make that much in its second year while actually helping people who need advocates. And how do you feel about that decision? Terrified and exhilarated. Like I'm finally building something that matters instead of just chasing numbers. Marcus faced a different kind of crisis. One that forced him to confront the gap between his business school theories and the realities of working with people whose lives had been shaped by very different experiences than his own. The restaurant where he worked as assistant manager served a diverse customer base in downtown Seattle, and Marcus had been slowly earning the respect of both his colleagues and the regular customers through his work ethic and genuine efforts to improve operations. But his privileged background occasionally created friction that he was still learning to navigate. The incident that shattered his confidence happened during a busy Friday night shift. The kitchen was understaffed due to 2 servers calling in sick, and the restaurant was packed with customers growing increasingly impatient with slow service. Marcus was trying to coordinate between the kitchen and the dining room when a particularly demanding customer began berating Sandra, one of the servers. "This is completely unacceptable," the man shouted, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "I've been waiting 40 minutes for my food, and this is supposed to be a professional establishment. Where is your manager?" Sandra, a single mother in her 40s who had been working in restaurants for 20 years, handled the situation with the practiced calm of someone who had dealt with difficult customers countless times. But the man wasn't satisfied with her professional apologies and explanations about the kitchen delays. "I don't want to hear excuses from some waitress. Get me someone who actually has authority to fix this problem." Marcus stepped in, intending to de-escalate the situation and support Sandra. But instead of calming things down, his intervention made everything worse. "Sir, I'm the assistant manager, and I can assure you that we're doing everything possible to get your order out quickly. If you'd like, I can offer you a complimentary appetizer while you wait." The customer looked Marcus up and down, taking in his clean appearance, his confident posture, and his educated way of speaking. Finally, someone with some sense. "Why didn't they send you over here in the first place instead of wasting my time with the help?" The dismissive way the man referred to Sandra as the help made Marcus's blood boil. But before he could respond, Sandra touched his arm and shook her head slightly, warning him not to escalate the confrontation. Marcus handled the immediate situation professionally, getting the customer's meal expedited and ensuring he left satisfied. But afterward, Sandra asked to speak with him privately. "Marcus, I appreciate you stepping in, but I need you to understand something. When customers like that see you, they see someone who looks like them, someone who belongs in a position of authority. When they see me, they see someone they can treat badly because they think I don't have other options. That's not fair to you." "No, it's not, but it's reality. And when you jump in to save me from situations I've been handling successfully for 20 years, you're reinforcing the idea that I need rescuing, that I'm not capable of managing difficult customers on my own." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His intention had been to support a colleague, but his actions had inadvertently reinforced the very dynamics he thought he was opposing. "I didn't realize. I was just trying to help. I know, and I appreciate the intention. But you need to understand that your help comes with privileges I don't have. When you offer to comp someone's meal, it costs the restaurant money that comes out of everyone's tips. When you smooth things over with difficult customers, you're using advantages that I can't access. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sandra patiently explaining dynamics that Marcus had never considered despite his business education and years of working in restaurants. She helped him understand that his race, gender, education, and way of speaking gave him automatic authority that his colleagues had to earn through years of proving themselves. It's not that you shouldn't use your advantages, Sandra explained. It's that you need to be aware of them and think about how your actions affect the people around you who don't have the same privileges. That night, Marcus called me more shaken than he had been at any point during the challenge. Mom, I think I'm starting to understand why this challenge was necessary. I thought I was learning about hard work and financial responsibility, but I'm really learning about privilege and how it affects every interaction I have. How do you feel about that? Humbled and embarrassed about how oblivious I've been. Sandra has been working twice as hard as me for 20 years, earning half as much and dealing with treatment I would never tolerate. And I walked into that restaurant thinking my business degree made me qualified to improve their operations. What are you going to do with that knowledge? I'm going to listen more and assume less. I'm going to ask people what they need instead of deciding for them. And I'm going to use whatever advantages I have to create opportunities for people who haven't had the same breaks I've had. Marcus spent the following weeks rebuilding relationships with his colleagues, asking questions instead of making suggestions, and learning about the restaurant industry from people who had worked their way up through every position, rather than people who had studied it in graduate school. The real transformation came when he proposed a profit-sharing program that would give all employees a stake in the restaurant's success rather than just hourly wages. It was an idea he developed by listening to his colleagues talk about their financial challenges and their ideas for improving customer service. I presented it to the owner as a way to reduce turnover and improve morale, Marcus told me. But really, I presented it because Sandra and the other servers have great ideas about how to make the restaurant better, and they deserve to benefit from the success they help create. The program was implemented 2 months later, and Marcus was promoted to general manager with a salary that would allow him to complete his challenge. But more importantly, he had learned to see his role as creating opportunities for others rather than just advancing his own career. Sophie's crisis was the most public and, in many ways, the most devastating. Her art had been gaining recognition through her booth at Pike Place Market, and she had developed a following of customers who appreciated both her artistic skill and her authentic connection to the working-class subjects she painted. But her success attracted the attention of a blogger who specialized in exposing what he called poverty tourism among wealthy artists. He had somehow discovered her family connection and published a scathing article titled, "Rich Girl Playing Poor, The Fake Struggle of Sophie Johnson." The article was brutal in its assessment of Sophie's challenge, describing it as a privileged young woman playing dress-up as a struggling artist while knowing she had a safety net that real struggling artists would never have. It included photos of her family's wealth, details about my technology company, and interviews with other artists at Pike Place Market who felt that Sophie was taking opportunities away from people who truly needed them. "She's not really struggling," one artist was quoted as saying. "She's just slumming it for a year before going back to her trust fund. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here trying to pay rent with our art because we don't have other options." The article went viral in Seattle's art community, and Sophie found herself at the center of a controversy that questioned not just her authenticity as an artist, but her right to occupy space in a community of people facing genuine financial hardship. The comments section was even more brutal than the article itself. People called her a fraud, a dilettante, and worse. They questioned whether any of her success was based on merit or simply on people feeling sorry for someone they perceived as struggling. Sophie called me the day the article was published, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "Mama, they're right. I am a fraud. I'm not really struggling like the other artists. I have you as a safety net. I have an education they paid for. I have advantages that real struggling artists don't have. I have an edgy otao. I don't belong here. Sophie, do you believe your art is good? I thought it was, but now I don't know. How can I tell if people are buying it because they like it or because they feel sorry for me? How did you feel about your art before this article was published? Proud. Like I was finally creating something that mattered to people, something that reflected real experiences and emotions. Has the article changed your art? No, but it's changed how I feel about it. It's changed how I feel about myself. The controversy forced Sophie to confront questions about authenticity, privilege, and the nature of artistic struggle that most artists never have to consider. She was facing criticism not just for her art, but for her very presence in a community that she genuinely wanted to be part of. But the response from her customers surprised everyone, including Sophie herself. A group of people who had bought her paintings organized to defend her work and her place in the market community. They wrote letters to the blogger, posted positive reviews of her art online, and most importantly, continued to buy her paintings because they connected with the work, not because of her personal story. Mrs. Johnson might come from money, wrote Elena, the nurse Sophie had befriended at the coffee shop. But her paintings capture something real about the dignity of working people that I've never seen in art before. She didn't paint these pictures from a place of privilege. She painted them from a place of genuine respect and connection. Another customer, a construction worker named James, wrote, "I don't care what Sophie's bank account looks like. She sees me as a person worth painting, worth celebrating. That matters more than whether she understands every detail of financial struggle." The defense from her customers taught Sophie something crucial about authentic artistic connection. People responded to her work not because of her personal circumstances, but because she had learned to see and portray the humanity in subjects that many artists overlooked or romanticized. I realized that authenticity isn't about having the right credentials or the right amount of suffering, Sophie told me. It's about genuine connection and respect for your subjects. The fact that I have advantages doesn't invalidate my art if I'm using those advantages to shine light on people and experiences that deserve attention. The controversy also forced Sophie to be more transparent about her background and the challenge she was undertaking. Instead of hiding her family connection, she started talking openly with other artists about her experience learning to support herself through her work. "I'm not pretending to understand lifelong financial struggle," she would tell people. "But I am learning what it means to have your livelihood depend on your art, and that's teaching me to take both my work and my customers more seriously." Some artists remained critical, and Sophie lost some customers who felt deceived by her family background. But she also gained respect from people who appreciated her honesty and her willingness to acknowledge her privileges while still working to earn her place in the artistic community. Most importantly, the controversy forced Sophie to develop a much clearer understanding of her artistic purpose. She wasn't trying to cosplay as a struggling artist or prove that she could survive poverty. She was learning to use her artistic skills and her eventual advantages to create work that honored and celebrated people whose stories weren't often told in art galleries. "I want my work to build bridges between different communities," she explained to me. "I want people who have advantages like I do to see the humanity and dignity in people they might otherwise overlook. And I want people who are struggling to see themselves reflected with respect and beauty." By the 8th month of the challenge, all 3 of my children had faced their own version of what psychologists call an identity crisis. They had been forced to confront not just their financial dependence on family wealth, but their entire understanding of who they were and what they were capable of achieving. Rebecca had discovered that her legal skills were most valuable when applied to problems that mattered to people who had no other advocates, even if that work paid less than corporate law. Marcus had learned that his business education was only useful when combined with humility and genuine respect for people whose experiences differed from his own. Sophie had realized that authentic art came from honest connection rather than personal credentials. But they had also discovered something more fundamental: that their worth as human beings wasn't determined by their bank accounts, their family connections, or even their professional achievements. They were developing self-respect based on their contributions to other people's lives, rather than their accumulation of personal advantages. The financial results by the 8th month were mixed but encouraging. Rebecca was earning approximately $60,000 annually through her combination of part-time legal work and consulting, putting her on track to reach her goal if she could maintain her pace. Marcus had been promoted to general manager with a salary of $75,000, exceeding his target but still working toward the full $100,000 through additional consulting work with other restaurants. Sophie was the furthest from her financial goal, earning about $40,000 annually through art sales and her coffee shop work. But she was also the most creatively fulfilled she had ever been, and her art was continuing to gain recognition and sales. More importantly than the numbers, though, was the transformation in how they approached problems, relationships, and opportunities. They had developed what I recognized as the entrepreneur's mindset, the ability to see challenges as opportunities, to create value where none existed before, and to persist through setbacks without losing sight of their goals. I used to think that having advantages meant I was supposed to use them to get ahead, Rebecca told me during our 8th-month check-in. Now I understand that having advantages means I have a responsibility to use them to create opportunities for other people. Marcus had a similar realization. Business school taught me to maximize profit and minimize costs. But working with real people taught me that the best businesses create value for everyone involved, not just the owners. Sophie's insight was characteristically artistic. I thought authenticity meant suffering, but it really means honesty. Being honest about your privileges, honest about your limitations, and honest about what you're trying to accomplish. As we entered the final 4 months of the challenge, I found myself less concerned about whether my children would reach their financial goals and more interested in whether they would maintain the growth they had achieved. They had discovered strengths they didn't know they possessed, developed relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial advantage, and found work that connected to purposes larger than personal advancement. But I also knew that the final months would bring their own test. Success can be as corrupting as failure, and I wondered whether my children would remember the lessons they had learned once the immediate pressure of the challenge began to ease. The question wasn't just whether they could earn $100,000 in a year. The question was whether they could become the kind of people who would use any amount of money wisely, whether they understood that wealth was a tool for creating value rather than simply consuming it. The challenge had 4 months left, but in many ways, the most important test was just beginning. The final 4 months of the challenge brought revelations that none of us had anticipated. What had begun as a test of my children's ability to earn money had evolved into something far more profound. A complete reimagining of what it meant to be successful, valuable, and worthy of respect. The turning point came on a cold February morning when I received 3 phone calls within the span of an hour, each from one of my children, each with news that would reshape our family dynamic forever. Rebecca called first, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since she was a child discovering something magical. "Mother, I need to tell you about something incredible that happened yesterday. Do you remember Maria Santos, the woman whose deportation case I lost last year?" Of course. Maria's case had been the catalyst for Rebecca's crisis of confidence. The moment when she realized that legal victories meant more than just winning arguments. She called me from Mexico. She's been working with immigrant advocacy groups there, helping families prepare for asylum applications and connecting them with resources. But here's the amazing part. She said that the work I did on her case, even though we lost, gave her the knowledge and confidence to help other people navigate the system. Rebecca's voice was trembling with emotion. She said that losing her case taught her more about immigration law than she'd learned in 10 years of trying to stay invisible. She said I gave her a voice she never knew she had. That's wonderful, Rebecca. But that's not all. Maria connected me with a network of lawyers, advocates, and former immigrants who are building a new kind of legal practice. They're creating a model where successful cases in the United States fund advocacy work in Mexico and Central America, where people can get help before they're forced to make dangerous border crossings. I could hear the passion in Rebecca's voice, the same intensity that had driven me to work 18-hour days when I was building my company. They want me to lead the Seattle branch of this network. It would mean starting my own practice, but with built-in referrals, shared resources, and a mission that goes beyond just individual cases. Mother, I could build something that actually addresses the root causes of immigration crises instead of just responding to the symptoms. What would that mean for your challenge? That's what I'm calling about. This opportunity would require me to turn down higher-paying corporate work and focus entirely on immigration law. I probably won't reach the $100,000 target this year, but I could build a practice that makes that much while actually changing lives. Rebecca paused. And when she continued, her voice was steady and certain. I've realized that the challenge was never really about the money. It was about discovering what I'm capable of building when I have to depend on my own skills and vision. I've found that. Whether I inherit your money or not, I know now that I can create something meaningful. And what have you decided? I'm going to take the opportunity. I'm going to build something that matters more than any inheritance ever could. Marcus called 30 minutes later with news that was equally unexpected. Mom, you're never going to believe what happened. Remember the profit-sharing program I implemented at the restaurant? Well, word got around the industry, and now I have 3 other restaurant owners who want me to help them design similar programs. That's excellent, Marcus. But it gets better. One of them connected me with a venture capital firm that specializes in socially responsible investing. They're looking for someone to help them evaluate restaurant and hospitality investments, specifically someone who understands both the business side and the worker experience. I could hear the excitement building in Marcus's voice. They offered me a position as their hospitality sector analyst. The salary would be more than enough to complete the challenge, but that's not why I'm interested. They want me to help them identify restaurants and hotels that treat their workers fairly, that create opportunities for advancement, that share profits with the people who create value. You'd be investing other people's money in businesses that align with your values. Exactly. And I'd be using everything I learned working in the kitchen, all the insights I gained from Sandra and the other servers, to help direct capital toward companies that treat their employees as partners rather than expenses. Marcus's voice became more serious. Mom, I understand now why you were so passionate about your work. It wasn't just about making money. It was about using money to create the kind of world you wanted to live in. How do you feel about that realization? Like I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. That wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. That success means creating opportunities for other people, not just accumulating advantages for yourself. Sophie's call came just as I was processing the implications of Rebecca and Marcus's news. Mom, I have something to show you. Can you meet me at the Pike Place Market in an hour? Sophie, what's this about? Just trust me. This is important. An hour later, I stood in front of Sophie's booth at Pike Place Market, staring at something I had never expected to see. Her usual display of paintings had been transformed into something that looked more like a community center than an art installation. There were still paintings for sale, but they were surrounded by information tables, resource guides, and what appeared to be a small lending library. People were gathered around the booth not just to buy art, but to access services, share information, and connect with other community members. Sophie, what is all this? It's called the Invisible Hands Project. Remember how I named my art series after the working people who keep our city running? Well, I realized that painting them wasn't enough. I wanted to create something that actually supported them. Sophie gestured to the different sections of her expanded booth. This section provides information about workers' rights, health insurance options, and financial literacy resources. This part connects people with local services, food banks, job training programs, affordable housing resources. And this area is for community building. People can share skills, offer services, or just connect with others who understand their experiences. I watched as a young mother approached the booth, not to buy art, but to ask Sophie about childcare resources. Sophie handed her a comprehensive packet of information and spent 10 minutes connecting her with other parents who had formed a babysitting cooperative. How did you develop all this? I started by listening to the customers who bought my paintings. Elena, the nurse, told me about how hard it was to find reliable childcare for her mother. James, the construction worker, mentioned that he wanted to learn computer skills but couldn't afford classes. Maria, who cleans offices downtown, said she wished there was a place where working people could connect with each other for support and friendship. Sophie's eyes were bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her true calling. I realized that my privilege isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be leveraged for people who don't have the same advantages. I can afford to spend time researching resources, making connections, and organizing information in ways that busy working people can't. And your art? The art is still central to everything. But now it's part of a larger mission. People buy paintings to support the project. And the project supports the people who inspired the paintings. It's a complete ecosystem instead of just individual transactions. Sophie showed me a folder filled with documentation of the project's impact. In just 2 months, the Invisible Hands Project had connected dozens of people with resources, facilitated the formation of 3 mutual aid groups, and raised enough money through art sales to provide emergency assistance to families facing crisis. Mama, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to use art as a tool for community building and social support. I want to create beauty and provide practical help at the same time. What about the financial challenge? I'm not going to make $100,000 this year from art sales alone, but I've learned something more valuable than money. I've learned how to create value for other people. I've learned how to use my advantages to build something bigger than myself. Sophie paused and looked directly at me. I've also learned that the most important inheritance you could give me isn't money. It's the example of how to use whatever resources I have to make the world better. That evening, I sat in my office reflecting on the 3 conversations that had fundamentally changed my understanding of what the challenge had accomplished. My children hadn't just learned to earn money independently. They had discovered how to create value for other people, how to use their skills and advantages in service of something larger than their own success. But they had also surprised me by making decisions that prioritized purpose over profit, impact over income. They were choosing paths that might not lead to immediate financial success, but would allow them to build the kinds of careers and lives that aligned with their values. The question now was whether I would honor the spirit of what they had achieved or hold them to the letter of the original challenge. I spent the weekend reviewing everything that had happened over the past 11 months, not just the financial records and progress reports, but the transformation in how my children approached problems, relationships, and opportunities. Rebecca had evolved from a corporate attorney who served wealthy clients to a community advocate who was building bridges between legal systems and the people they were supposed to serve. Marcus had grown from a privileged MBA who understood business theory to a practitioner who recognized that sustainable success required creating value for everyone involved in an enterprise. Sophie had transformed from a dilettante artist who painted abstract concepts to a community organizer who used art as a tool for social connection and mutual support. Most importantly, all 3 had developed the qualities I had hoped the challenge would teach them: resilience, empathy, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding that their advantages came with responsibilities to others. The financial scorecard at the 11-month mark showed mixed results according to the original parameters. Rebecca was on track to earn about $85,000, Marcus would exceed the $100,000 target, and Sophie would reach approximately $60,000. But measuring their success in dollars felt increasingly irrelevant compared to what they had actually accomplished. I called each of them and asked them to meet me in my office on the same Saturday morning where this journey had begun nearly a year earlier. They arrived looking very different from the 3 entitled adults who had proposed a family foundation to control my spending. Rebecca wore a simple professional outfit that looked purposeful rather than expensive. Marcus had the confidence of someone who had earned respect through work rather than inherited it through family connections. Sophie carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had found her place in the world through service rather than privilege. Before we discuss the challenge results, I began, I want each of you to tell me what you've learned about yourselves this year. Rebecca spoke first, her voice clear and steady. I learned that I had confused credentials with competence, success with significance. I thought being a good lawyer meant winning cases and making money, but I discovered that being a good lawyer means fighting for justice, even when it's difficult or unprofitable. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I also learned that my privilege isn't something to feel guilty about, but it's not something to take for granted either. I have advantages that create responsibilities. I can access systems and opportunities that are closed to other people, which means I have an obligation to use that access to open doors for others. Marcus nodded and continued. I learned that leadership isn't about having authority over other people. It's about creating opportunities for other people to succeed. I thought my business education made me qualified to improve other people's operations, but I discovered that real improvement comes from listening to people who understand their work better than I ever could. His voice became more thoughtful. I also learned that sustainable success requires building systems that work for everyone involved, not just the people at the top. Businesses that treat workers as expenses instead of investments are ultimately unsustainable because they're not creating real value. Sophie's reflection was the most emotional. I learned that authenticity isn't about suffering or credentials. It's about honest connection and genuine service. I spent years trying to be a serious artist by copying what I thought serious art looked like. But I became a real artist when I started paying attention to real people and real experiences. She wiped away tears that had started forming. Most importantly, I learned that my advantages don't disqualify me from communities of people who are struggling. They qualify me to contribute to those communities in ways that honor and support the people who welcomed me. I looked at these 3 adults, my children, who had become people I genuinely respected and admired. Now I want you to tell me what you think this challenge was really about. Rebecca answered immediately. It wasn't about the money. It was about discovering who we are when we can't rely on inherited advantages. It was about learning to create value instead of just consuming it. Marcus added, it was about understanding that wealth is a tool, not a trophy. That the point of having money isn't to prove your worth, but to create opportunities for yourself and others to contribute something meaningful to the world. Sophie's insight was characteristically profound. It was about love. You loved us enough to let us struggle, to let us fail, to let us discover our own strength. You could have kept taking care of us forever. But instead, you gave us the chance to learn how to take care of ourselves and other people. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the sealed letters I had written 11 months earlier, the ones intended to encourage them during the darkest moments of their challenge. I wrote these for you to read if you wanted to give up, I said, handing each of them an envelope. But I think you should read them now instead. They opened the letters and read in silence, and I watched their faces change as they realized that I had always believed they were capable of becoming exactly the people they had become. Rebecca looked up first, her eyes bright with tears. You knew we would find our way to this. I hoped you would. But I also knew that if you were going to become the people I believed you could be, you had to discover it for yourselves. No one could give it to you. Marcus folded his letter carefully. So what happens now? Do we pass or fail the challenge? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where my children were now building their own contributions to the city's future. You've already passed the only test that mattered. You've proven that you understand the difference between earning money and creating value. You've shown that you can use your advantages to build something larger than yourselves. I turned back to face them. The financial targets were never the real goal. They were just a way to force you to discover what you were capable of achieving when you had to depend on your own skills and vision. Sophie leaned forward. But what about your will? What about the inheritance? I'm rewriting my will, I said. But not because you met or didn't meet arbitrary financial targets. I'm rewriting it because you've proven that you would use inherited wealth the same way you've learned to use earned income, as a tool for creating opportunities and solving problems, rather than just accumulating advantages. I returned to my desk and pulled out a new document. This is my new estate plan. It establishes 3 foundations, each managed by one of you, each focused on the work you've discovered you're passionate about. Rebecca, yours will fund legal advocacy for immigrant families and communities. Marcus, yours will provide capital and support for businesses that prioritize worker ownership and profit sharing. Sophie, yours will support community art projects that combine creative expression with social services. But each foundation comes with the same requirement that guided this challenge. You have to continue earning your own livelihood through work that creates value for other people. The foundation money can't be used to support your personal lifestyle. It's for the work, not for you. Rebecca was the first to understand the implications. You're giving us the tools to build the kinds of careers we've discovered we want, but you're not giving us the option to become dependent on inherited wealth again. Exactly. I'm providing resources for your mission, not subsidies for your lifestyle. Marcus smiled, the kind of genuine smile I hadn't seen from him since he was a child. You're still challenging us. You're still pushing us to be better than we might choose to be on our own. I'm giving you the chance to spend your lives creating the kind of world you want to live in, with the resources to make a real impact, but not so much security that you stop growing." Sophie stood up and hugged me, something she had done regularly as a child but rarely as an adult. "Thank you for loving us enough to let us become ourselves." The conversation continued for another 2 hours as we discussed the details of how the foundations would work, how they would measure success, and how my children would transition from their current work to their new roles as social entrepreneurs. But the most important part of the discussion was about family. We talked about how this experience had changed not just their relationship with money and work, but their relationship with each other and with me. "I understand now why you were so frustrated with us when we proposed that family foundation," Rebecca said. "We were treating you like someone who needed management instead of someone whose wisdom we should have been trying to learn from." Marcus nodded. "We were so focused on what we thought we deserved from you that we never asked what we could contribute to the family legacy you were building." Sophie's insight was typically artistic. "We were living in the shadow of your success instead of learning from your example. We were consumers of your achievements instead of creators of our own." As my children prepared to leave, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond anything I had experienced in my business career. I had built a technology company that changed how people think about data security, but I had also raised 3 human beings who would spend their lives using their advantages to create opportunities for others. The challenge had ended, but their real work was just beginning. 6 months later, I received updates that confirmed my faith in what my children had become. Rebecca had launched her immigration law network and was already handling cases in 3 cities, with a model that was being studied by law schools and advocacy organizations across the country. Marcus had joined the venture capital firm and was directing investments toward restaurants and hospitality companies that were pioneering new models of worker ownership and profit sharing. His first fund had already supported 12 businesses that were creating hundreds of jobs with dignity and genuine advancement opportunities. Sophie's Invisible Hands project had expanded to 5 locations across Seattle and was being replicated in other cities by artists who wanted to combine creative expression with community support. Her paintings were now displayed in galleries that understood art as a tool for social connection rather than just aesthetic appreciation. But perhaps the most meaningful update came in the form of a joint letter from all 3 of my children. "Dear Mom," it began, "we wanted you to know that the challenge you gave us wasn't just about learning to earn money or becoming financially independent. It was about learning to love the way you love, by demanding the best from the people you care about, by creating opportunities for them to discover their own strength, and by using whatever advantages you have to build something larger than yourself. We understand now that wealth isn't something you accumulate for your own benefit. It's something you create and share in service of values that matter more than personal comfort. We understand that privilege isn't something to feel guilty about, but it's not something to take for granted either. It's something to leverage for people who don't have the same advantages. Most importantly, we understand that the greatest inheritance you could give us wasn't money. It was the example of how to live a life that creates value for other people. How to use success as a platform for service rather than just personal advancement. Thank you for loving us enough to challenge us. Thank you for believing in us even when we didn't believe in ourselves. Thank you for showing us that the purpose of wealth is to create opportunities for others to discover their own strength and build their own success. We love you, and we promise to continue earning the trust you've placed in us." I read that letter sitting in my office, looking out at the Seattle skyline, where my children were now building their own contributions to the community that had given our family so much opportunity. The challenge had cost me nearly a year of normal family relationships and countless hours of worry about whether I was being too harsh, too demanding, too willing to risk their resentment in pursuit of their growth. But it had given me something priceless. 3 children who understood that love isn't just about providing comfort and security. Love is about demanding excellence, creating opportunities for growth, and believing in people's potential even when they don't believe in it themselves. The $100 million I had threatened to give away was still mine to distribute, but now I was distributing it to foundations managed by people who understood that money is a tool for creating opportunities rather than a prize for existing. My children had learned that wealth is something you create through service rather than something you inherit through accident of birth. They had discovered that success isn't about accumulating advantages, but about creating value for other people. Most importantly, they had learned that the greatest gift parents can give their children isn't financial security. It's the knowledge that they are capable of building their own security through work that contributes to something larger than themselves. The challenge was over, but the real work of living lives worthy of the advantages they had been given was just beginning, and I had complete confidence that they were prepared for that work, because they had proven they could create value, even when they couldn't rely on inherited advantages. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.